Well, this is the the third and final part of my presentation on the postal history of the Dodecanese Islands. This is where we left off last week. Last week I concentrated on the Italian period from 1911 until after World War II, 1947, 48. The Italians controlled these islands, which are primarily inhabited by Greeks, but uh, the Italians, even before the Balkan Wars began, the Italians captured these islands from Turkey as a result of their war with Turkey, in which they acquired quite a bit of territory in Africa as well as these islands. What we're seeing here is the mouth of the harbor at Rhodes, a place where it's thought that once upon a time the famous Colossus at Rhodes was located, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. In fact, that'll be the final part of this presentation. I
Oh, okay,
have a
cool.
number of artists' conceptions of what the Colossus at Rhodes looked like. This is about the transition from Italian to German control of the islands. An armistice between Italy and the Allies, signed on September 1943. The Italian garrison at Rhodes surrendered to the Germans, but other islands put up resistance, and uh, especially on the island of Leros, the Italians were very loath to turn over control to the Germans. Then the Germans had control for about 2 years. They extended their stay in the Dodecanese Islands even after the fall of Berlin. Um, they surrendered finally to the Allied forces on May 8th, 1945. And after that, for a couple of years, the islands were administered by Great Britain. And of course, that they issued stamps for use there as well. And we'll see some of those. This first set of stamps is stamps that had been issued during the Italian period, um, the pictorial stamps that I showed last time that had been overprinted by the German occupiers. They're essentially charity stamps in Italian pro assistenza Egeo for the assistance of the Aegean Islands. The lower row of stamps has the overprint with the decoration of the deer. It's native to Rhodes, the so-called Dama Dama deer, and pro sinistrati di guerra for the casualties of war. It's much easier to find these stamps unused. They were overprinted in large numbers, and of course collectors were interested in them, but there are only a few that actually were used. Another set of stamps previously issued during the Italian period in the 1930s, 1934, overprinted in with silver ink, again for casualties of war. Now this is not the cover I mentioned that I had acquired in the auction. This is a fabulous example of German military stamp. Well, this is the German military stamp, together with some other stamps overprinted during the German occupation.
For
Um,
Christmas.
right, Weihnachten, 1944.
Wonderful calligraphy by the sender.
Yes, indeed. This cover is really a treasure. It's a prime example of the use of this stamp with the Inselpost overprint, which was only used for literally a few days. They were ordered by the commander of the German occupation on Leros. But as soon as the German command at Rhodes found out about it, they countermanded this order and ordered that the stamps be destroyed. They didn't apparently agree that there was any need to overprint the military stamps with this Inselpost for use on the islands.
They did use that overprint for other areas of the world, like the Kurland Peninsula, which is in Latvia, received Inselpost stamps as well because it was cut off from all land communications with Germany.
Really? Okay,
Yeah.
now that's something I was not aware of. As far as I knew, the Inselpost overprint was only used in the Greek islands.
No.
But if I'd like to
Yeah.
find out more about that.
Alan, can you read the date of the cancellation?
February 16th, 1945.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Well, within the period, the German occupation didn't end until May. So this was February,
But long after Weihnachten.
month and a half after Christmas. That's right. As I mentioned, I did acquire another Inselpost overprint on cover, not this stamp, but a different. They put the overprint on these as well as on some parcel post issues, and all of those stamps were given to German soldiers to use to send mail back home. You notice there's no denomination given. It's just Luftfeldpost Deutsches Reich. They were given out, a limited number were given to each soldier to use, and they could also send them to their correspondents in Germany to be used for return mail so that the person writing to them wouldn't have to pay the postage. This cover was offered in the Cherrystone auction for a starting bid of $4,500. Which is, above the. And if they would take away one of the zeros, I might have considered making an offer. But this is another example, and this is one of the parcel post stamps with the Inselpost overprint. And this one was addressed to Crete, and we know that from the Feldpost number from Leipzig. Here's an example where the stamp was actually given by the soldier or by someone in the military to a person in Leipzig who used it to send the letter to Crete. 1944, postmark Leipzig Reichsmessestadt. So that's looks like April 3rd, 1945. Okay, now we're getting to the transition between German control and British. This one is from December 4th, 1945, after the Germans had left. It's a very interesting cover, and I'm not going to be able to give you all the details about it. You notice it's franked. This is a stamp that had been issued by the Italian Social Republic during the war. This was Mussolini's enclave. And after the war, they took these stamps and overprinted them for regular Italian postage. So that's a post-war surcharge, and sent from Macerata, which is a place on the Adriatic coast of Italy, to Rhodes. We see here the British postage due stamps. Apparently there is a postage due, and I assume this marking here refers to the amount of postage due. Maybe it's 10 lira or something, which translates into 6 pence. I mean, that's just a guess on my part. And I cannot read this inscription. It looks as though it might be Greek, but I just cannot make it out. The cancellation in Rhodes is still the Italian cancellation, Rhodi Egeo, on these British postage due stamps. And there is a censor marking here, a posta estera, or foreign post censor. So altogether, a very interesting cover from December of 1945.
You wonder why it was censored at that point.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've seen lots of other mail in the years following the war. They kept up the censorship. The fallout from World War II lasted for years afterwards. There was still military conflict in some places. There were, for example, the Civil War in Greece. And the final settlement in the international treaties that finalized the settlements after World War II took years to go into force.
Yes, Yugoslavia in particular.
Right. So there was quite a bit of censorship that continued in the aftermath of the actual war. Here's an airmail cover addressed in Greek to the Ionian Bank in Athens, postmarked Rhodes, Dodecanese, with the British stamp with MEF, Middle East Forces, overprint. Those were the stamps that were in use for the 2 years of British occupation. Here are some more of them. This is a rather unsatisfactory cover. It looks very much as though there was another stamp here that was removed, but at least we have here some high values with the MEF overprint. And again, addressed to the Ionian Bank in Athens. All right, finally, we get to the transition of the islands to Greek sovereignty. So there were a number of steps involved. So exactly when the islands became part of Greece kind of depends on which of these steps you consider the most important. There was the signing of the Treaty of Paris between the Allied forces and Italy, um, in which Italy ceded the Dodecanese Islands to Greece after having controlled them for about 35 years. Then, May 31, 1947, the British commander turned over control to the Greek admiral at the beginning of the period of Greek military occupation, or military administration, I should say. And then finally, Greece ratified the Treaty of Paris in October 47. In January, Greece officially approved the treaty, the entry of the Dodecanese Islands into the Greek state, retroactively dating that to October of 1947. I'm not exactly sure what was supposed to be symbolized by that. Finally, on March 7th, 1948, the official union of the Dodecanese Islands with Greece, and the king and queen of Greece visited and were greeted enthusiastically by most of the residents. Here's a picture of ceremonial uh, entry of Greek authorities. I'm not exactly sure who is who here. One of these is undoubtedly the Greek king, but whether it's this man or this man, I'm not quite sure. And a number of women with sashes bearing the names of the islands. Here's Rhodes. Here's Astypalia, Kalymnos, Patmos, Kazos.
I wonder during this period of return of the islands to Greece, if Turkey reasserted its demands. They never were satisfied with the settlement, as evidenced by what they did in Cyprus.
Well, yes. Of course, the Turks to this day are not happy with the arrangement. Some of these islands are very, very close to the Turkish mainland.
Right.
And you know that Turkey was deprived of these islands by Italy originally in 1911. And the best you can say is the Italians stole them fair and square. They attacked. It was an unprovoked attack, an aggressive action on the part of the Italian government, which wished to acquire a colonial empire. And they saw an opportunity with a weak enemy. Well, anyway, back to the Greek military administration. The stamps that were issued to be used there during this period, the initial part of the Greek administration, before the islands formally became part of Greece. This is the overprint, stands for military administration of the Dodecanese. And these are the landscape stamps that had been issued during the German occupation of Greece in the early 1940s. They've been revalued. Originally here it's 2,000 drachmae, been revalued to 10. These are called the chains surcharges just because of the decoration around the value. So these were the stamps that were in use in Greece at the time, and they're overprinted here for use in the Dodecanese. It's the usual story with these stamps. A few of them were overprinted with the sigma delta delta. And then it was immediately noticed that these were becoming collector's items. So the postal authorities decided to go ahead and put these initials on all the stamps so as to avoid the creation of rarities, which they always seem to want to do. Here are some more stamps, again with the sigma delta delta overprint. These stamps show King George II of Greece, who had only recently been reinstated as king in a plebiscite of 1/9/1946, September 1st, 1946. There was a referendum essentially on whether the Greek people wished to have the king come back to his post and be and rule over Greece, and it was successful, and he was invited back after the war, and then he only lived for less than a year after that. This is the memorial stamp. April 1st, 1947 is when he died. The stamps originally had the surcharge and they had the date, and a black line here, the sort of memorial black line, was added for the memorial issue. The Greek stamps, the regular Greek stamps issued for this memorial have a large black edge that covers the perforations. But in the case of the Dodecanese, they used a smaller black line. So here's a set of the stamps that were all overprinted with sigma delta delta. All they're stamps from the occupation landscapes and from an earlier issue. This is from the historical issue, 1937, I believe it was. Okay, well, now we get to the stamps that commemorated the entry of the Dodecanese Islands into Greece officially. They were issued in November 1947, and there's some interesting scenery shown on the stamps. This is the island of Castellarizo, a very small island, but very densely settled and very near the Turkish coast. This Colossus, 1824, refers to events of the Greek War of Independence, roughly from about 1822 to 1830. The ships of the merchant ships of Colossus were requisitioned and armed for use in the war against the Turks. And the Turks took reprisals on the island for that. They invaded and really destroyed a large part of Kossos and its population in 1824. Then this is the island of Patmos, monastery there, monastery of St. John, the purported author of the book of Revelation in the Bible. Some more Dodecanese subjects. Here's a vase and costume. This man, Emmanuel Xanthos, was active also in the Greek War of Independence. His dates are 1772 to 1852. He helped to create a society, one of the many secret societies that existed in the early 19th century. Societies formed to win the independence of various national areas from the larger empires they were part of. At that time, large empires, the Austrian, the Russian, the German, the Turkish, and so forth, and many of the population, many of the peoples of these empires were at that time campaigning for national independence. So he helped to form a society called the Society of Friends, Tiliki Hetairia, in 1814, devoted to Greek independence from Turkey. Interestingly, he and many others in this area were influenced by the ideas of Freemasonry. The Freemasons had a strong hold in the Greek islands, especially Corfu and other Ionian islands. But there was a lot of nationalistic ferment at this time. And many countries around the world gained their independence in those early years of the 19th century.
I noticed the 30 drachma, the denomination does not have an X at the end.
That's right. It doesn't.
And it's a period instead.
Yes.
It's abbreviated.
Well, DRX is also an abbreviation. In fact, that might even be a period I see right there.
Yeah, I think you're right. The third stamp has it too.
I can't explain that. But you have a sharp eye, Phil.
To look at these stamps, you would never think they're from the same set. They're
Well, that's true.
Different.
Yes, they were probably designed by different people. It's a set that you saw very heavy use. This actually was the primary set of stamps used in Greece for about the next 10 years, till 1958. So there are many covers with these. And they're common, you know, it's easy to acquire a set of these, mint or used. the inclusion of the Dodecanese Islands in Greece was the final step in the creation of the Greek nation as we now know it. So it was celebrated very enthusiastically.
The 250 looks engraved. Was it the 30 looks lithographed?
I
Wildly different.
Yes, I don't think any of these are engraved. I
Yeah, yeah,
believe they're all typographed or lithographed.
yeah.
Yeah. Although, sometimes the lines can be pretty sharp if it's carefully done. So here's the famous stamp we saw earlier from the very, very brief period of independence on the island of, I believe this was Kalymnos. The inscription at the bottom is Commonwealth of the Islanders. And it has this wonderful image of the sun god. Certainly a memorable stamp celebrated on this commemorative. This is Hippocrates, who was from the island of Kos, which is one of the Dodecanese. And finally, we have the Colossus at Rhodes as conceived by one particular artist. And as you say, shown straddling the harbor, the entrance of the harbor of Rhodes. Well, nobody really knows exactly where it was located, whether it straddled the harbor or just sat on a platform. No part of it remains, and there's really no record of what it looked like or exactly how it was positioned. So let's look at some other pictures of how other people have envisioned it. These are just, shall we say, harvested from the internet. I don't have the details as to who the artist is or when these were made. If you go online and look up Colossus at Rhodes, you'll find dozens of pictures. So, and here's another one. The idea seems to have been that there was a torch of some kind that would be lighted and would emit flame and smoke. Now, whether that's historical, I have no idea. You'll notice in the backgrounds, the hills on these are pretty high, higher than on the actual island. And we'll see an even more extreme example of that later. Here's a case where the artist simply envisioned the statue standing on a single plinth rather than straddling. It's quite possible that it was that way. Well, here's an example where, these look like practically like, mountains in the Andes or someplace, much more rugged than the actual island of Rhodes. It's hilly, but not like this. This is the most dramatic image I could find, a stormy image with the Colossus glaring at us.
Sail around the edge there into it doesn't really look like it's a harbor there. It's out in the middle of nowhere.
Well, there is a faint background here behind the ships. I'd see something, but you're right. It looks like it's out at sea, doesn't it? And these pillars look gigantic. It's been a long, long time. There have been many changes. Many empires have come and gone, and many. The city of Rhodes has been captured and sacked and pillaged over, many times by various armies, and so that statue has completely vanished. All right, so here's an example of the use of the stamps on a cover, sent from the island of Chios. We have the sun god stamps and the Patmos and the Dodecanese costume. Interestingly, this letter might appeal to some of you because of being sent to the state of Maine, principal of Maine University. Finally, two stamps issued in 1968 to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the inclusion of the Dodecanese. In this map, you see all of Greece is colored in kind of an ochre, except these are the Dodecanese Islands down here. We've got Rhodes and Carpathos and the others. Okay, so that's the end.